I'm Christiana Knight. Welcome to Standard Deviant School, American Government. Today's program is the executive branch. We'll focus on the head honcho of the executive branch, the President of the United States. We'll look at how a person becomes president, what the president does, and what special powers the president has. Ooh, special powers. Do you suppose the president has X-ray vision?
First, we'll turn back the clock and examine what the framers of the Constitution had in mind when they created the executive branch and the office of the president. Then we'll see how the president gets elected and what the basic qualifications for being president are. Finally, we'll check out the 6 main powers of the presidency. So, what are we waiting for? Let's get presidentially inclined.
Way back when America was being built and the Articles of Confederation were being questioned, the framers of the Constitution decided the best way to organize government was through the creation of branches.
The framers thought it would be good for the American people to have one person appointed to represent and speak on behalf of the nation. This person would be called the President, and the President would be the main component of the executive branch. The executive branch executes laws. Thus, it carries out and enforces the laws once Congress has passed them.
Get it? Executive? Execute? Executive? Executive. Okay, I thought so.
The President is an elected official of the United States government. Not many would argue against the opinion that the President is the most important and prominent figure in the United States government. Well, with that kind of role, how exactly is this President person elected, and what kinds of qualifications should he or she have?
How to choose the President was a pretty sticky issue for the framers of the Constitution. Some thought the President ought to be elected by the American people. Others thought the legislature should vote for the President. And still others felt the President should be selected via an arm wrestling competition. Yarr! Like most debates in American government, a compromise was reached, and the Electoral College was born.
The Electoral College is a unique American institution which is made up of representatives from each state called electors.
Don't confuse these reps with the reps in the House of Representatives. These electors are chosen by methods determined in each individual state. These electors vote for the president after the popular vote. The popular vote is cast by the American public, but the public doesn't really vote for a president. They vote for electors who are supposed to vote for the candidate they said they would. To become president, a candidate must receive a majority of the electors' votes.
Because of this role of the electoral votes, some pretty funky stuff has come out of the past presidential elections. Once, during the 1876 elections, presidential candidate Samuel Tilden had more popular votes from the people, but lost the election because he did not have the majority of electoral votes. Grover Cleveland lost his re-election when he had a majority of the popular votes, but not enough electoral votes. And once, in the election of 1824, the Electoral College had no majority, so the House of Representatives had to pick the president.
More recently, in the 2000 election, Vice President Al Gore received more popular votes than his opponent, Texas Governor George W. Bush, but received only 266 electoral votes to Bush's 271. Those 271 votes were enough for Bush to become the 43rd President of the United States.
The Electoral College determines who gets to be president. Then what determines who can run for president? Well, that rule and more can be found in the Constitution. The qualifications for office for the president and vice president include 1. Being at least 35 years old, 2. Being a natural-born citizen of the United States, and 3. Being a resident of the United States for at least 14 years. Both men and women can become presidents. However, to this day, no woman has been elected to the position of President of the United States.
And then there's the term of office.
The term of office was set in the Constitution at 4 years with unlimited eligibility for re-election.
But then in 1951, a few years after Franklin D. Roosevelt was elected for the 4th straight time, the 22nd Amendment was added to the Constitution.
The 22nd Amendment limited the president to 2 4-year terms, or a maximum of 10 years.
Should a vice president be appointed president due to impeachment or death or some other reason, and then get re-elected for 2 more full terms, he or she may only serve a total of 10 years.
If those are the rules for getting presidents into office, there must be a few for kicking them out. Of course.
Impeachment is the process for removing an official from office for any number of offenses, including treason, bribery, and other high crimes and misdemeanors.
First, the House of Representatives starts off the process by conducting a thorough investigation of the president's possible misdoings. If the findings smell illegal, the House then votes on whether or not to impeach the president, which is kind of like an indictment, with a majority vote making the decision.
If the majority votes to impeach, the Senate then steps in to act as a court of law which will try the president for the accused offenses. These possible offenses are called the Articles of Impeachment, the specific charges brought against the president. The Senate trial is presided by a member of the judicial branch, the Supreme Court Chief Justice. In order to convict a president, the Senate must have a two-thirds vote on any of the Articles of Impeachment. If the two-thirds vote is achieved, then El Presidente makes history and is kicked out of office.
When a president leaves office, the vice president automatically takes his place. But what happens if the vice president is also impeached, or suddenly keels over, or wants to take up a career in floral design? What then, huh?
Well, it used to be that the Congress voted for who became president if both the president and the vice president are knocked out of commission. But that was kind of iffy and vague. Therefore, the Presidential Succession Act of 1947 was passed and made the new rule of thumb.
The Presidential Succession Act outlined the order of who would be the next president. First, the vice president, followed by the Speaker of the House, followed by the President pro tempore of the Senate, then the Secretaries of State, Treasury, and then Defense. After that follow all the cabinet secretaries in the order of the cabinet's creation.
Now, there's one other case in which the president's powers must be given to someone else. If a president becomes incapacitated but continues to hold the office of the president, someone has to make the executive's decisions. This responsibility falls to the vice president, who, based on the contents of the 25th Amendment, must temporarily act as president if the president is incapacitated.
Now that we know the nitty-gritty of getting to be president and getting stripped of the presidential title, I'll bet you're wondering what exactly the president does.
Compared to the distinct and well-laid-out powers of the legislature, the powers of the president started out rather vague.
The framers of the Constitution did this purposely, because they did not want one man having too much authority within an entire government. This makes sense, of course, but over the years, the president and the executive branch have indeed gained and expanded on powers that the framers did not originally hand out.
Let's take a look at the 6 main powers of the president, and you'll see how this leader's authority is constructed and has grown. The 6 main powers are the appointment power, the power to convene Congress, the power to make treaties, the veto power, the power of commander-in-chief, and the pardoning power.
U.S. Ambassador to South Vietnam, Henry Cabot Lodge, is resigning to devote his efforts to the coming Republican presidential campaign. President Johnson's appointment of General Taylor emphasizes once again this
Power 1, the appointment power.
The appointment power of the president was instituted in order to help the president with the enforcement of laws made in Congress.
The appointment power gives the president the power to appoint, with the advice and consent of the Senate, a whole bunch of smart, helpful folks, such as ambassadors, public ministers and counsels, justices of the Supreme Court, federal judges, and other officers of the United States.
This ought to be recognized as a pretty big power. The people the president chooses for these various positions are the people who, in many cases, determine public policy and law. That's why the Senate is extremely cautious and prudent in accepting the president's nominees.
Today, the president has the authority to make over 3,000 appointments, and all these appointments are influential government positions.
Some of the most important appointments made by the president can be found in the cabinet. The cabinet is the formal body of presidential advisors who head 14 departments within the American government. Such departments include the Treasury Department, the Agricultural Department, Defense Department, and the State Department. All the heads of all the departments and a few other people the president might want to include, like the ambassador to the UN, make up the cabinet. The cabinet is populated by presidential advisors who aid in many policy and law-making decisions.
Along with the power to appoint, the Prez also has this power.
Power 2, the power to convene Congress.
Tonight, the cup of peril is full in Vietnam.
The power to convene Congress basically means that the president has the authority to get together both houses of the Congress in case of an emergency in order to get things done. The president is also required to convene Congress yearly and give what is called a State of the Union address.
The State of the Union address is when the President tells the Congress where the country is and where it's going. Lots and lots of topics can be covered in the State of the Union, including economic stability, health care, education, foreign affairs, baseball scores, and other important issues that affect America.
Since the communication technologies of radio and television, the President has also used the State of the Union address to reach the American public. If you're American, you've probably watched the State of the Union address.
Power 3, the power to make treaties.
The power to make treaties is a really cool power.
President Johnson rolled out the red carpet to welcome Prime Minister Mohammed Hashim Maiwandwal to the White House.
Treaties are agreements between two or more countries. They have to do with war and peace, the environment, trade, or just about anything else.
The President called the Afghan leader a good friend. The Premier responded that his country, which borders the Soviet Union, is determined to follow a policy of non-alignment.
Of course, with almost every power, there's a kryptonite-like weakness. The President's kryptonite is almost always one of the other two branches of government. In the case of the power to make treaties, it's this.
In order to make a treaty with another government, the President must have the approval of 2/3 of the Senate.
There's always a loophole, isn't there? If the President is really bent on making a treaty and he knows the Senate isn't going to back him, he can make something else instead, called an executive agreement.
An executive agreement is a method by which the President attempts to get around the treaty process by entering into secret and highly sensitive arrangements with foreign governments without approval by the Senate.
The catch with these agreements is that unlike treaties, executive agreements are not binding on subsequent administrations. That means if a president makes an executive agreement, the next president that comes into office doesn't have to stick to that agreement if they don't want to. But even though these agreements are not written in stone, they still tend to give the president a lot of power when it comes to foreign relations.
Power 4, the veto power.
You should already have a good grasp on this power, but we'll review it again for you.
The power to veto means the President has the power to reject any piece of congressionally passed legislation.
Over my dead body!
This power is called a qualified negative. This basically means in normal non-political terms that even if a pres vetoes something, the Congress can override that veto with a 2/3 vote. However, in reality, the Congress has rarely been able to override. It's possible they're afraid the President is going to beat them up or something.
Power 5, the power of the Commander-in-Chief.
Demonstrators protest U.S. involvement in the Vietnam War.
You may have heard people describe the President as the Commander-in-Chief. Well, that's not just another term for President. The term Commander-in-Chief describes the leader of the armed forces. So the President is the leader of the armed forces of America, including the Army, Navy, Air Force, Marines, Coast Guard, and National Guard. The President holds all the power of the highest military leader of the country.
Over the years, this has been a pretty controversial power, especially when the presidential office can be held by someone who has no military background or experience. Politicians and interest groups have raised the question of how well an individual who has never served in a military can actually lead a military.
Remember that we listed the power to declare war as a legislative power. However, the power to enforce all necessary laws, as well as override legislative powers, has been given to the Commander-in-Chief, the President of the United States.
Because America's past is filled with presidential military decisions, some of them considered by Congress as rather hasty and debilitating, Congress passed an act that restricted the President's ability to commit combat troops without their say-so. This act is called the War Powers Act.
The War Powers Act, passed in 1973, even after President Nixon initially vetoed it, limits the President's authority to send American troops into dangerous enemy territories without congressional approval. The act didn't prevent Nixon from sending troops into Vietnam, and each president since has doubted its full constitutionality.
The President has a lot to say when it comes to waging war, and declaring war, as we just illustrated via Nixon's actions. However, as usual, there are ever-watchful checks and balances within the other branches of government to keep anything too crazy from happening.
I would have to say that it was principally Colson and sometimes Haldeman.
Power 6, the pardoning power.
From my office that had political implications to it.
The power to pardon is not a frequently used power, but it's still important.
A pardon is an executive grant releasing an individual from the punishment or legal consequences of a crime before or after they are convicted.
If you're a common criminal, your chances of getting a pardon from the president are roughly that of Keanu Reeves winning the Oscar for Best Actor. On the other hand, plenty of former presidents and political bigwigs have gotten off the hook more times than a guppy at a bass fishing contest.
President Ford pardoned former President Nixon, and President Jimmy Carter pardoned a bunch of Vietnam draft dodgers who fled to Canada during wartime.
Well, those are the 6 main presidential powers. Now let's review what we've covered in our program.
Article 2 of the Constitution established the executive branch. The executive branch is responsible for executing and enforcing the laws passed by Congress. The main entity of the executive branch is the President of the United States.
The choosing of the president occurs via a popular and electoral college vote. The qualifications for the office of the president include being at least 35 years of age, being a natural-born citizen of the United States, and being a resident of the United States for at least 14 years.
The term of office was set in the Constitution at 4 years. The 22nd Amendment limited the presidential office to 2 4-year terms, or a maximum of 10 years. There are 6 current presidential powers: the appointment power, the power to convene Congress, the power to make treaties, the veto power, the power of commander-in-chief, and the pardoning power.
We hope we've given you some insight into the office of the presidency, and maybe even given you the thought of running for president one day. Who knows? Maybe you'll make it. And if you're looking for someone to take the job of Postmaster General, Ambassador to Jamaica, or some other plush appointment, remember me, Christiana Knight. It's Christiana with a K. Christiana Knight. Call me. Thanks for watching Standard Deviant School, American Government. See you at the White House.